The cracks in their certainty began to show, and she, calm and poised, watched and waited, knowing that patience and clarity were her greatest tools. By the time the car reached the station, the tension in the air had grown palpable. The woman was still composed, her hands cuffed, her posture straight, her expression serene. She had been treated unfairly, judged prematurely, and yet she had managed to maintain control of herself, of her emotions, and of the narrative she refused to let others define. And as the patrol car pulled to a stop, and the officers prepared to step out, she took a quiet breath and readied herself. The next moments would test patience, power, and assumptions. But she was ready. She always was. The police station loomed ahead, a gray building with harsh fluorescent lights that seemed to make the air inside feel colder than it was outside. The patrol car rolled into the small parking lot, tires crunching over gravel, and the woman could feel the officers' unease, even if they tried to hide it behind stern expressions. She remained silent, sitting upright in the back seat, hands still cuffed, watching everything around her, every sound. The clicks of the officers' boots on the concrete, the distant hum of a fan, the faint buzz of fluorescent lights, was sharper in contrast to the tense quiet between the three of them. The taller officer opened the car door first. "Come on, let's move," he said, his tone brisk, trying to sound in control, though the slight tremor betrayed him. She stepped out, careful and measured. Her heels clicked softly against the concrete, each step echoing slightly in the empty space outside the main doors. The shorter officer followed behind, glancing around nervously as though expecting the world itself to judge him for what he was about to do. Inside the station, the air smelled faintly of disinfectant and paper. The walls were painted a dull beige, lined with posters reminding people of their rights and the importance of community cooperation. The woman noticed the contrast between the official messages on the walls and the actions she had just experienced outside. It was ironic, almost cruel, how the ideals of justice were printed on the walls while the people inside often acted so differently. The officers led her to a small room at the back of the station. It had a metal table, a few hard chairs, and a large window that looked out onto the parking lot. The fluorescent light overhead flickered for a moment, adding a slightly tense, almost surreal atmosphere to the room. She took a seat when prompted, moving slowly and deliberately, her hands cuffed in front of her now. She kept her posture straight, her chin level, her eyes calm and steady. The taller officer leaned against the table, arms crossed, while the shorter one stood near the door. They exchanged looks again, a silent conversation that conveyed frustration and confusion. She knew what they were thinking. They assumed authority, power, control, but she had neither fear nor submission in her eyes. That imbalance, small as it was, began to tilt the room in subtle ways, and she sensed it. "Do you have identification?" the taller officer asked, his voice sharper than necessary. "Yes," she replied, reaching into her handbag with deliberate slowness. She wanted to make sure every movement was controlled, deliberate, and non-threatening. She produced her driver's license and handed it over. The officer took it and examined it closely, his brow furrowed. "Name's correct. Address matches what we have on record." She nodded slightly. "Yes, everything should match. I've lived here for years and I've always complied with the law." He made a note on a clipboard, then looked up. "You were seen in this area acting suspiciously." She tilted her head, not in confusion but in a subtle challenge. "Suspiciously?" "I was walking to my car. I had done nothing unusual. I am happy to answer any questions, but I don't understand what makes my actions suspicious." The shorter officer muttered something under his breath, a sharp sound of irritation. "You don't get it. People know when something isn't right. You know, walking around acting the part. Just step back and answer questions without pushing back." Her eyes narrowed slightly, not aggressively but with a quiet firmness. "I am answering questions. I'm explaining what I was doing." "Isn't that the proper way to handle this? Why assume bad intentions without proof?" The taller officer sighed, clearly impatient. "We're just doing our job. You can make this easier or harder. That's your choice." She leaned back slightly, still calm. "I am making it easier by cooperating and answering honestly. I am not making it harder. The assumption of guilt before investigation, however, is something that is not just unfair. It's dangerous." The officers exchanged a glance, something unspoken passing between them. They were trained to see situations in simple terms: suspect, victim, authority, compliance. She did not fit the mold, and it made them visibly uncomfortable. After a moment of silence, the taller officer spoke again, trying to regain control. "We're going to run your information." "It's routine," she nodded. "Of course. I expect nothing less." He left the room briefly, walking toward a small office where a computer waited. The shorter officer lingered by the door, still visibly tense. She could feel the air shift in subtle ways. The power dynamic was no longer clear-cut. The officers had authority, yes, but the certainty they carried into the situation had started to waver. She had not said much, had not acted defensively or aggressively, yet she had already begun to influence the energy of the room simply by being calm, composed and unwavering in her dignity. She glanced around the small room, noticing the details she would normally ignore, the scuff marks on the walls, the way the fluorescent light flickered slightly, the faint smell of paper mixed with cleaning solution. Observing details like this was second nature to her. She had learned to read situations, to notice subtleties others missed, to anticipate outcomes before they unfolded. She was careful not to make it obvious, but she was aware of every movement, every glance, every slight shift in the officer's posture or tone. After a few minutes, the taller officer returned, looking at a screen and muttering something under his breath. He stepped back, trying to hide the surprise that crossed his face, but she noticed it immediately. "What is it?" she asked quietly, not aggressively, just with curiosity. He cleared his throat. "Your information. Everything seems normal. No warrants, no alerts, nothing unusual." She nodded again. "Good, I expected as much." The shorter officer snorted. "Well then why the trouble outside? Why the fuss?" She looked at him steadily. "Because assumptions were made. Assumptions based on appearance, perhaps? On a sense of threat rather than facts?" They both hesitated, the air thick with tension. It was clear they were aware on some level that their own biases had guided their actions. She could see it in the slight tightening of their shoulders, in the way they avoided eye contact for a moment. They had judged her without evidence and were now confronted with the reality that she had done nothing wrong. The taller officer adjusted his posture, attempting to regain composure. "Sometimes mistakes happen. You understand that, right?" She leaned slightly forward, hands cuffed but resting on the table, her voice calm but firm. "Yes, mistakes happen. But assumptions that lead to public humiliation or unnecessary detention are not mistakes. They are consequences of bias. And consequences must be addressed." The room fell silent again. Her words had an impact that could not be ignored. They were trained to enforce the law, to maintain order, but they were not trained to deal with someone who spoke truth so plainly, who refused to be intimidated, who stood her ground without aggression or fear. For a moment, the shorter officer simply stared, unsure whether to argue, to apologize, or to retreat. He felt the weight of his own actions, the reality of having acted on impulse rather than judgment. The taller officer tapped his pen against the table, the sound sharp in the quiet room. She remained composed, not pressing, not angry, just allowing the truth of her words and the reality of the situation to settle around them. She could feel a subtle shift. The officer's certainty had cracked. They no longer dominated the room with confidence. They were uncomfortable, aware that the situation was no longer theirs to control completely. Minutes passed in quiet tension. The woman's calm, deliberate presence contrasted with the officer's growing unease. Every glance, every word, every subtle motion reinforced her dignity and their loss of unchallenged authority. She did not gloat, she did not provoke. She simply existed in the space with clarity and composure, making them confront the reality of their assumptions. Finally, the taller officer broke the silence. "We need to document this. Standard procedure. Sit tight for a moment while we complete it." She nodded once. "Of course. I will cooperate fully. But please remember what I said about assumptions and fairness." He nodded curtly, though the tension in his shoulders remained. The shorter officer shuffled papers, avoiding eye contact, clearly unsettled by the encounter. She remained silent, hands resting on the table, her gaze steady. As they worked, she reflected quietly on the situation. She had faced many challenges in her life, some public, some private, some that demanded every ounce of patience and composure. This was one of those moments. It was a test not of strength but of restraint, not of power but of patience, and she was determined to maintain her dignity, her calm, and her clarity. Outside the room, the faint noises of the station continued. Phones rang, footsteps echoed. Radios crackled with Saint. Inside, the three of them existed in a bubble of tension and anticipation, a moment suspended in time. She could feel the shift in the officers' attitudes, the subtle realization that their authority was not absolute, that assumptions could be challenged, that calm confidence could change the dynamics of even a stressful, unjust situation. Time moved slowly, each second heavy with unspoken tension. The woman remained composed, watching, listening, thinking. She was aware of how easily things could escalate, how quickly misunderstandings could become dangerous. But she trusted her preparation, her awareness, her patience. She knew that acting impulsively would only make things worse, and as the minutes passed, the subtle shift continued. The officers were no longer certain, no longer confident, no longer commanding the room with unquestioned authority. The calm, composed woman they had assumed was just another suspect had already begun to redefine the interaction, simply by being herself, clear, confident, and unshakably composed. The minutes stretched on in the small, fluorescent-lit room, heavy with quiet tension. The woman sat upright, hands cuffed in front of her, eyes steady on the officers who now moved with subtle unease. She noticed everything, the way their shoulders stiffened when she spoke, the small hesitations in their movements, the barely noticeable quick glances toward the doorway as if seeking some invisible backup. She remained calm, careful not to provoke, knowing that the slightest misstep could escalate the situation. The taller officer had returned to the small office to run her information through the system, muttering under his breath as he typed. The screen glowed faintly in the dim office, casting flickering light onto his face. The woman observed quietly, picking up on every detail. The slight hesitation in his fingers, the occasional pause as if he were searching for something he did not expect. The shorter officer leaned against the wall, his arms crossed, his face tight with unease. Both officers seemed to sense that this moment was no longer straightforward. Finally, the taller officer spoke, his voice low and slightly tense. "There's something unusual about your record." She raised an eyebrow, keeping her tone calm. "Unusual? How so?" He glanced at the screen again, muttering softly. I need to verify a few things." Sit tight for a moment. The words were clipped, but the hesitation in them was unmistakable. Something had shifted in the dynamic. Their certainty, which had been so solid outside in the street, had cracked. She noticed the subtle tension, the almost imperceptible flicker of worry in the taller officer's eyes. She stayed silent, letting him process, observing the scene with quiet awareness. A few moments later, he returned, holding a small sheet of paper from the printer, and his hand trembled slightly as he extended it toward his partner. The shorter officer leaned over, peering at the information, and for a brief moment both men froze, their expressions caught between disbelief and sudden caution. The woman tilted her head slightly, sensing the change. She had not said anything, had not acted differently, yet the subtle shift in their energy was unmistakable. The room felt smaller somehow, charged with tension, the authority that had seemed absolute moments before now tentative, almost fragile. "What is it?" she asked quietly, her voice steady, calm. The taller officer swallowed hard, his fingers gripping the edge of the desk. We need to confirm something. You may want to explain this." She remained still, her gaze unwavering. "Explain what?" The shorter officer's face shifted, a mix of shock and unease coloring his features. He muttered under his breath, words almost inaudible. The taller officer looked at him sharply but did not speak. It was clear that whatever they had discovered was unexpected, perhaps even frightening. Finally, the taller officer looked directly at her, eyes wide with a mix of disbelief and caution. Your name comes up in the system as..." He faltered, as though the words themselves were difficult to form. "The FBI director's wife." For a moment, the room was silent. The words hung in the air, almost tangible, heavy with meaning. The officers who had carried themselves with certainty and authority only moments before, now froze in a way that betrayed a sudden, jarring shift in power. The shorter officer's mouth opened slightly, but no words came out. He seemed unable to process what he was seeing. The woman remained calm, her expression neutral, but the faintest trace of irony flickered in her eyes. She had anticipated that her identity could change the situation, but the suddenness with which it had done so was remarkable. She observed the officers, noting every flicker of hesitation, every subtle movement that revealed their shock. You're the FBI director's wife?" the taller officer asked finally, his voice barely above a whisper. She nodded once, her voice calm and measured. Yes, that is correct. The shorter officer took a small step back, as though distance might give him more control over a situation that had clearly spiraled beyond his understanding. We didn't know, he began, but he trailed off, unable to complete the sentence. She remained silent, letting the weight of her words and her presence settle over them. The irony of the situation was sharp. The officers who had assumed authority over her, who had judged her and treated her harshly, were now confronted with a reality that completely upended their assumptions. The balance of power once so clearly in their hands had shifted entirely. The taller officer rubbed his forehead, clearly struggling to maintain composure. We didn't mean to. We thought, she held up a hand, stopping him mid-sentence. I understand that assumptions were made and mistakes happen. But that does not erase what occurred. Being judged unfairly, detained unnecessarily, and treated with suspicion based on nothing more than appearance is not acceptable. The words hit them hard. They had expected submission, perhaps defensiveness, maybe even fear, but not this calm, unwavering assertion of dignity and truth. Their uncertainty grew, mingled now with a tangible fear of consequences. They had no idea how this situation would unfold, only that their previous confidence had vanished. The woman observed the subtle panic in their faces, but she did not exploit it. She remained composed, deliberate, and patient. She had learned long ago that control was not taken by aggression, but by clarity, by calmness, by allowing truth and reason to shape the interaction. She knew that anger or confrontation would only make the situation worse. Patience, observation, and dignity were her allies. Minutes passed in tense silence. The officers exchanged quiet, hurried words, glancing at each other nervously. Their whispers carried the weight of fear, of realization that their actions outside had consequences far beyond what they had imagined. They had acted on bias, on assumption, and now they faced someone whose identity rendered their mistakes starkly visible. The taller officer finally spoke, his voice shakier than before. We need to contact higher authorities. Standard procedure, she nodded calmly. Of course. I expect nothing less. It is important that the situation is addressed appropriately. The shorter officer glanced at her, eyes wide, as if seeking some clue about how she would react next. She offered none. Her calm presence, her measured movements, and her steady gaze made it clear that she was in control of her own composure, even if the circumstances were unpredictable. The officers left the room briefly, speaking hurriedly into their radios. She could hear snippets of their conversation, enough to know that they were explaining her identity to someone higher up, someone who could manage the situation with authority. She remained seated, hands cuffed but relaxed, aware of every sound and movement around her. The room felt different now. The oppressive tension from before had shifted to something heavier, more charged but no longer one-sided. She could sense the fear and hesitation in the officers, the uncertainty about how to proceed, and the dawning realization that their assumptions had been completely wrong. She thought about how quickly the situation had escalated and how fragile the perception of authority could be when faced with truth and composure. It was a lesson that had been reinforced many times in her life. Power was not absolute, and assumptions, especially those made without evidence, could be dangerous. When the officers returned, they were accompanied by a supervisor, a more senior figure who carried an air of calm authority. She observed him closely, noting the difference in demeanor compared to the two who had detained her. He approached the table, glanced at her, and nodded politely. "Ma'am," he said, his tone professional and neutral. "We understand that there has been a misunderstanding. We'd like to resolve this as quickly and respectfully as possible." She inclined her head slightly, acknowledging him without aggression or accusation. "Thank you. That is all I have requested from the beginning." The supervisor motioned for the other officers to step back. He looked at her ID, confirmed her identity, and then turned to the two officers, speaking in a tone that was firm but measured. She listened quietly as he outlined their errors, the assumptions they had made, and the steps that would follow to address the incident internally. The officers shifted uncomfortably, clearly chastised by the supervisor's words, and the weight of accountability settled over them. For the first time, their actions outside the arrest they had conducted with such certainty were being scrutinized. Their assumptions, their biases, and their premature judgments were now the focus of attention, and their will, as nothing they could do to avoid it. The woman remained seated, composed, observing the process. She had been prepared for this moment, aware that once her identity was known, the situation would change drastically. Yet she did not relish the officer's discomfort. She remained focused on clarity, fairness, and ensuring that justice, however small, was acknowledged. The supervisor concluded the discussion with clear instructions. The woman would be released immediately, and the two officers' conduct would be reviewed. She nodded, her expression calm, her posture still straight. The resolution was not about revenge or satisfaction. It was about recognition, fairness, and the acknowledgement that assumptions based on appearance could no longer dictate actions. As she was uncuffed and allowed to stand, she felt the subtle shift in energy around the room. The officers who had once held power over her now looked uncertain, hesitant, and cautious. She walked toward the door with measured steps, aware of the eyes on her but focused on the simple act of leaving the station with dignity intact. The experience had been unnerving, unfair, and tense, but it also reinforced a quiet truth. Composure, clarity, and self-respect could shift even the most precarious balance of power. She had maintained her dignity throughout, and in doing so, she had reminded the officers and herself that assumptions and bias were fragile when met with patience, observation, and calm authority. As she stepped out into the evening air, the city buzzing quietly around her, she allowed herself a small private exhale. The ordeal was over, but the lessons, the reflections, and the stark reminder of the fragility of assumptions would stay with her. She had faced an unexpected challenge, navigated it with poise, and emerged with her dignity intact. The balance of power had shifted, and the officers had learned in their own difficult way that assumptions could never replace respect, fairness, or awareness. The air inside the police station had shifted dramatically since the revelation. The two officers who had initially arrested the woman now moved with caution, their confidence replaced by a hesitant wariness. Each gesture, each glance seemed to betray the weight of the realization that they had misjudged her. She sat quietly at the metal table, hands resting on the surface, her calm demeanor unchanged. Every detail of their discomfort was apparent to her, and she observed it with a quiet awareness, knowing that the balance of power had altered entirely. The supervisor remained nearby, his presence authoritative but measured, a steadying force in the room. He had already started making calls, documenting the incident, and ensuring that the situation was handled properly. The woman understood that this was part of the process, a necessary step to ensure accountability, but she also knew that how the officers responded now would reveal much about their character. "You understand the seriousness of this situation, don't you?" the supervisor asked, addressing the taller officer. "Yes, sir," the officer replied, his voice strained, betraying an unease that he could not fully mask. He avoided eye contact with the woman, as though doing so might make the truth of his earlier actions even more glaring. The supervisor nodded slowly. "Good. Then we will proceed accordingly. You will write a full report of the events, and this will be reviewed by Internal Affairs. Mistakes like this cannot be repeated." The woman listened in silence, her calm expression never faltering. She had been through situations where authority figures had made errors or acted on assumptions. But the difference here was that the error had been public, observable, and directly linked to bias. She had maintained her composure throughout, and now the officers were being forced to confront the consequences. The shorter officer shifted uneasily, his hands fidgeting. "Ma'am, he began, but the supervisor cut him off with a firm glance. "This is not your time to speak. The situation will be documented and addressed officially. Right now it is our responsibility to ensure that everything is handled correctly." The woman inclined her head slightly, acknowledging the supervisor's authority. She understood the importance of maintaining decorum. Any impulsive words from her could escalate the situation unnecessarily. Patience, she knew, was essential. She had faced many tense situations before, and she understood that calm observation often mattered more than immediate action. The supervisor turned to her, his expression neutral but respectful. "We apologize for the way you were treated. Assumptions were made and those actions are being reviewed. You are free to leave, and we will ensure the proper procedures are followed." She nodded, her expression calm. "Thank you. I appreciate that this is being handled." The supervisor stepped back, allowing the two officers to stand near the doorway. Their movements were hesitant, almost defensive. The taller officer kept his hands loosely at his sides, while the shorter officer's gaze kept flicking toward the woman, uncertain and uneasy. Neither spoke. She remained seated for a moment longer, observing them carefully. She could see the subtle tension in their faces, the acknowledgement of wrongdoing, the fear of repercussions, and the awkwardness of realizing that their assumptions had been wrong in the most striking way possible. It was a moment of reckoning for them, and she allowed them the space to experience it. Finally, she stood, her movements deliberate and composed. The cuffs had been removed, and she adjusted her jacket slightly, smoothing her hair. Every gesture conveyed confidence, control, and dignity. The officers stepped back, giving her room, their earlier assertiveness replaced by cautious deference. As she walked toward the door, she spoke quietly but firmly. "I hope this serves as a reminder that assumptions and bias can have real consequences. It is important to act with fairness and respect, even when it seems unnecessary." The words hung in the air, and the officers could only nod, their faces showing the weight of their realization. They had been confronted with a situation that challenged their assumptions and forced them to recognize the gap between perceived authority and actual accountability. The woman stepped out of the room and into the main area of the station. The fluorescent lights overhead flickered slightly, and she could hear the faint hum of radios, the distant ringing of telephones, and the low murmur of voices from the front desk. She walked toward the exit with measured steps, aware of the stares from some of the personnel in the station but focused on her own composure. Outside, the evening air was cooler now. The city bathed in the soft glow of streetlights. Cars passed by and pedestrians moved along the sidewalks, unaware of the dramatic events that had unfolded inside the station. She took a deep breath, allowing the tension from the past hour to ease slightly. The experience had been unnerving, unfair, and challenging, but she had maintained her dignity throughout. As she walked toward her car, she reflected on the events. Assumptions had been made about her appearance, her behavior, and her intentions. Those assumptions had led to an unnecessary arrest and a tense confrontation. Yet through patience, composure, and clear communication, she had navigated the situation successfully. She understood that her identity had influenced the outcome, but she also knew that her calm and deliberate actions had played a significant role in ensuring the situation did not escalate further. When she reached her car, she paused for a moment, glancing back at the police station. The two officers were visible through the glass doors, still processing what had happened. She allowed herself a small private smile, not of triumph but of quiet satisfaction. She had faced a challenge that could have been humiliating or frightening, and had emerged with her dignity intact. As she got into her car, she reflected on the broader implications. Bias and assumptions were dangerous because they clouded judgment and led to unfair treatment. She had experienced it firsthand, and she understood the importance of addressing such behavior, not with anger or aggression, but with patience, clarity, and calm authority. She had made her point without confrontation, and the lesson had been clear to those who had misjudged her. Driving through the city streets, she noticed the familiar sounds, the distant honking of cars, the chatter of pedestrians, the hum of streetlights. The world moved on as it always did, but the events of the evening had left a lasting impression. She thought about the officers, about the internal reviews that would follow, and about the importance of accountability in positions of authority. She understood that their actions would have consequences and that the process of reflection and correction was essential for the future. The city passed by in a blur of lights and movement, but her mind remained focused on the lessons of the evening. Patience, composure, and clear communication had been her allies. Assumptions and bias had been challenged and exposed. Authority had been questioned, and accountability had been asserted. She knew that experiences like this were rare but significant, moments that highlighted the fragility of perception and the importance of fairness. When she arrived home, she parked her car and took a moment to gather herself. The quiet of her apartment contrasted sharply with the tension and drama of the evening. She closed the door behind her, the soft click echoing in the empty space, and allowed herself to breathe fully for the first time in hours. The ordeal was over, but the reflections it had prompted would stay with her. Sitting in her living room, she thought about the officers and the process that would follow. Internal reviews, documentation, and discussions with supervisors would ensure that the incident was addressed, and she hoped that it would serve as a meaningful lesson, not just for them, but for the broader system, for anyone who might assume authority without accountability. She understood the importance of these lessons and the role that calm, measured action played in shaping outcomes. She reflected on the subtle dynamics that had unfolded in the station, the shift in power, the realization of bias, the quiet assertion of dignity. Every moment had been a test of patience, observation, and composure. She had maintained control not through confrontation, but through calm awareness and deliberate action. The officers had been forced to confront the reality of their assumptions, and she had done so without anger, without fear, and without losing herself in the process. As the evening deepened into night, she allowed herself a quiet moment of reflection. The events had been intense, but they had reinforced important truths: the fragility of assumptions, the importance of fairness, and the power of composure and clarity. She had navigated a challenging situation successfully, and in doing so, had demonstrated that dignity and patience could shift even the most tense and unfair dynamics. She thought about the officers one last time, imagining them reflecting on the events, considering the consequences, and hopefully learning from the experience. She did not feel satisfaction in their discomfort, only a quiet hope that the lesson would be remembered, and that future interactions might be approached with more awareness and fairness. The night was calm outside her window, the city lights glowing softly, the distant sounds of traffic creating a gentle hum. She had faced an unfair situation, navigated it with composure, and emerged with her dignity intact. The lessons of the evening would stay with her, a reminder of the power of patience, clarity, and calm authority in the face of bias and assumption. She allowed herself a small, quiet smile. The ordeal had ended, the tension had eased, and the reflection it prompted would guide her and perhaps others in the future. She had faced an unexpected challenge, maintained her composure, and ensured that accountability was acknowledged. The evening had been a test, and she had met it fully with clarity, dignity, and strength. Here's to part 5, written in simple, natural, human-centric style, fully engaging, around 2,700 words concluding the story. The next morning, the city was already awake, buzzing with its usual rhythm. Cars honked, people hurried along sidewalks, street vendors called out to passers-by, and the faint hum of construction floated through the air. The woman stepped out into the sunlight, dressed neatly for the day ahead. Her movements were calm, measured, unhurried, carrying the quiet confidence she had maintained throughout the previous evening's ordeal. She felt the lingering tension in her shoulders begin to ease, replaced by a sense of clarity and focus. Her thoughts drifted back to the police station, to the officers whose assumptions had led to her arrest. She did not feel anger or vindictiveness toward them. Rather, she reflected on the fragility of authority and the weight of responsibility that comes with it. She understood that mistakes, especially those fueled by unconscious bias, were not simply personal failures. They were systemic. And yet, in that moment, she also saw the potential for growth and understanding. She hoped the lesson she had unintentionally imparted would resonate. She walked through the city streets with purpose, her mind clear and deliberate. Even ordinary things, the rhythm of her footsteps on the pavement, the soft rustle of leaves in the wind, the occasional greetings of familiar neighbors, felt grounded and comforting. She allowed herself to be present in the world around her, appreciating the small normalities that often went unnoticed. These small moments reminded her that life continued, even after intense experiences, and that perspective mattered more than lingering on discomfort or fear. At the office that morning, she entered with a quiet grace. Her colleagues greeted her warmly, oblivious to the drama she had navigated just hours before. She responded politely, her smile measured, her composure intact. The professional environment felt stabilizing, a space where she could focus on meaningful work rather than the shadows of the previous night. As she settled at her desk, her mind wandered briefly back to the incident. She thought about the two officers who had arrested her, their expressions frozen when they learned who she was. She imagined the internal reflection they must have experienced afterward, the questioning of assumptions, the acknowledgement of bias, the realization that their behavior had consequences far beyond the immediate moment. She did not take satisfaction in their discomfort, but she allowed herself to recognize the inevitability of accountability. By mid-morning, the supervisor from the police station contacted her office, ensuring that the formal apology was documented and that the incident would be reviewed thoroughly. She listened calmly, acknowledging the gesture without pride or self-congratulation. The process of accountability was important, she knew, not only for herself but for anyone who might be subject to similar assumptions in the future. It was a moment that reinforced the importance of fairness, of due process, and of reflection for those in positions of authority. During the conversation, she was careful to emphasize her perspective without confrontation. "I appreciate that this matter is being addressed," she said. "My hope is that lessons are learned, not only about procedure but about the assumptions we make and the importance of approaching every situation with fairness and respect." The supervisor responded respectfully, acknowledging her words. He promised that the officer's conduct would be reviewed thoroughly, that training would be reinforced, and that lessons about bias and professional behavior would be part of the follow-up. She appreciated the sincerity in his tone, recognizing that true change often began with acknowledgement and reflection. After the call, she took a moment to reflect privately. Experiences like these had a way of lingering, of creating internal ripples long after the external events had ended. She understood that part of moving forward was to process the situation fully, to examine her feelings, and to integrate the lessons into her own perspective. Sitting at her desk, she allowed herself to feel a mix of relief, reflection, and quiet empowerment. She also thought about the broader implications. Bias was subtle and often unconscious, and its impact could be profound. People made assumptions every day about appearance, behavior, and circumstances, and those assumptions could shape experiences in ways that were deeply unfair. By maintaining composure, clarity, and dignity, she had managed to navigate an unjust situation without escalating it. She had asserted accountability not through confrontation or anger, but through observation, patience, and quiet strength. Later that afternoon, she met with a small group of colleagues to review ongoing projects. She engaged in discussion with the same calm confidence that had carried her through the previous night. Her ability to navigate high-pressure situations translated seamlessly into her professional environment. People listened to her with respect, aware of her insight and clarity. She could see in their expressions the trust and confidence they placed in her judgment, a subtle reminder that composure and reason often carried more weight than force or aggression. As the day went on, she allowed herself brief moments to consider the personal side of the experience. She thought about the feelings that had surfaced during the arrest, the initial shock, the tension, the quiet calculation required to maintain calm. She had managed to stay present, to think clearly, and to observe the subtle dynamics of the officer's behavior. Those moments, intense as they had been, reinforced her understanding of human behavior, of the ways that assumptions and bias could shape interactions, and of the importance of maintaining self-awareness in the face of uncertainty. The experience had also reminded her of the importance of accountability. Authority carried responsibility, and those in positions of power could not act without consideration of the consequences. The officer's actions had been a stark example of what could go wrong when assumptions went unchecked. And yet she recognized that this moment also had the potential for positive change. Lessons learned, if internalized, could prevent similar incidents in the future. She felt a quiet hope that the officers would reflect on the experience with sincerity, and that their perspective might shift. By evening, she returned home, the city streets quieter now, bathed in the soft glow of streetlights. She paused briefly outside her apartment building, taking a deep breath of the cool night air. The tension of the day seemed to lift slightly, replaced by a sense of closure and reflection. She understood that the ordeal, while intense, had ended with dignity and clarity. The officer's reckoning, the acknowledgement of mistakes, and the process of accountability had all reinforced the lessons she had navigated quietly and deliberately. Inside her apartment, she settled into a quiet routine. She made herself a cup of tea, allowing the warmth to soothe the lingering tension. Sitting by the window, she looked out at the city lights, reflecting on the delicate balance of human interactions, the weight of assumptions, and the power of composure. The eve,